We think we might have found one of the worst deals in Australian history. I mean, if you think the Russians selling Alaska to the Americans in 1867 for just $7.2 million was a bad deal, what about selling a bunch of Australian hospitals, subsidised assets, essential services to the Cayman Islands? Well, it wasn't quite as simple as that. The New South Wales government privatised a hospital, Northern Beaches Hospital. The operator was Healthscope. It had another 41 or 42 private hospitals all around the country. There was a share market takeover by Brookfield, a foreign venture capitalist, vulture capitalist, for $5 billion. And this hospital and another 41 private hospitals were sold to the Cayman Islands. And we don't even know who the shareholders or the directors are because it's a secrecy jurisdiction in the Caribbean. You don't have to actually reveal that. The critical issue here, should we be privatising essential services and having no transparency over them? And what did we sell this thing for anyway? Did it benefit the state taxpayers? This is particularly critical as we head into the election, the New South Wales election in March. So this brings us to what we know and what we don't know. What I've got here is the lease deal, which took quite a bit of finding, which shows that the hospital at Frenchs Forest was sold to the Northern Beaches Hospital operator, now owned in the Caribbean, for $1 a year. The lease is for $1 a year for 20 years, and the car park lease is for 40 years, also at $1 on demand. We've asked the state whether they've actually held the private operator to account on this and got their $1 per year, and we're yet to get an answer. We're yet to get an answer to any questions. So here are the essential questions. Here's what we know and what we don't know. The lease is for $1, so they've sold it for nothing. We know that they spent $1.2 billion building this thing and the surrounding road infrastructure. That was a public expense, but we don't know what the private operator paid. It may have been, according to people that are familiar with these kind of deals, $300 or $400 million for the private hospital, and the state gets the public hospital for free. But we don't know. And why don't we know that? Because the good old transparency, the deed governing this transaction, the $1 lease, is redacted in the most critical parts. What else don't we know? We don't know what the monthly service payments are. We know there are 3 types of payments benefiting this entity in the Caribbean. We know that there is a monthly service payment for the public hospital portion. We don't know how much that is because they won't tell us, but it may be between sort of $50 million and $300 million a year. We know also that there are life cycle payments in the deed. We don't know what they are because they're redacted too. We don't know what life cycle exactly is, but it sounds like building maintenance. So we're also paying these guys to make a profit from these buildings, these essential services. We also know that it's a monopoly because they closed the Mona Vale Hospital further up on the Northern Beaches towards Palm Beach, and they closed my local hospital, Manly Hospital, as well, in order to funnel all the traffic through to the new hospital at Frenchs Forest. So that was a benefit, of course, to the private operators as well. Now, we know that the structure is a very fancy one, typical of Brookfield, the financial engineers. And we know at the very top of this structure in Australia is a thing called ANZ Hospital Topco. There's a bunch of other entities in there. It's all very mysterious. We've tracked them all, and we've got the accounts from ASIC, and we know that these guys don't pay tax. We also know, because we've been tracking Brookfield for years, that they don't like paying tax at all anyway. They are major league global tax avoiders. So they're not paying their fair share to operate in Australia anyway. And we know that the mob that controls the hospital in Australia, that is owned by the Cayman Islands entity, doesn't pay any tax either. So what are the benefits to the public from this transaction? Well, the state government got its hospital for free. It probably de-risked the construction and the financing, even though, of course, bonds, raising debt on bond markets was so cheap for the state, and we were awash in stamp duty revenues. So we didn't really need to do this anyway. But it gets us back really to this issue of transparency. It also gets us to the issue of accountability, because people have died as a result of negligence by this hospital. And under the deed, there are things called step-ins, effectively breaches, where the government can review the licence, perhaps revoke the licence of the hospital operator if there are too many step-ins. We don't know what the step-ins are because they're not made public either, but we do know because we wrote the tragic story of Joshua Gill, a 14-year-old who ended up dying after being released from the hospital, and there was a chain of events. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy, but we do know that the father, Andrew Gill, and the family sued the hospital operator for an undisclosed settlement and won in a private criminal prosecution. So we know there are breaches. I've had other people ring up or email me and say that there were similar situations where they claim there was negligence by the hospital. To be fair to the hospital operator, their performance generally, although they have been accused a bit of grifting the Northern Sydney Health District, which is the regulator, but their performance in terms of health outcomes has not been awry. It has been okay. But that's not the point. The point is there is no transparency. Did we actually sell this thing to these people for nothing? Was it 300 or 400 million to make money from sick and injured people on the northern beaches? These kind of essential assets are better off in public hands because, of course, they would be run by people acting in the public interest rather than by foreign investors trying to make a profit out of patients in Australia. There's a clause in the deed which says that the operator should run this thing at as little cost as possible, which of course it would do because it's a private operator based offshore, so it wants to make a profit. Nothing wrong with that. But what about the accountability? We've tried to call the regulators here and they've completely spurned us. They've just pointed us to the hospital. The hospital's hardly going to tell us and reveal all their breaches and so on. But there really should be an investigation into this because under the Morrison and Frydenberg federal government, and they were the ones to approve the sale to the Caribbean, the Foreign Investment Review Board, the state government did the deal, privatised it, and the federal government allowed it to go offshore. There's been a record number of assets go offshore under Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, and this really needs more scrutiny. We are literally selling the farm. Now, we're going to keep on this. We appreciate your support. If you can throw us a few dollars a month, that would be fantastic, and we'll keep the spotlight on these deals for you as the proxy holding power to account.